great. It's so wonderful that so many people are here. My name's Jane Anderson. I am coming to you from Lenape-Hoking, the lands of the Lenape nations. I'd like to pay my respects to the ancestors and to the elders, as well as to the emerging leaders of these lands and waters. I also want to acknowledge that the talk that we're going to give today really takes settler colonialism as a present day condition. And much of our work is trying to shift and to reorient how, and I would say centre, Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous cultural authority around cultural collections. So I'll hand over to Felicia.
Jane. Haku everyone, I'm Felicia Garcia. I'm Samala Shumash. I am based in Tewa territory though, Ogopogeawinge or Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I am the community outreach manager for local contexts. I'll pass it to Corey.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Corey Rowe. I'm also based in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral and present homelands of the Lenape peoples at New York University, and I am the local context institution outreach manager, and I'll pass it to Jeanette.
Kia ora no tātou. Thank you, Corey. Nā mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, ko Jeanette Hamilton Pearsa Ho. I'm of Te Whana Apanui ancestry in the Waikato Tainui lands for the Waikato University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm the local context program lead with the background in information systems for Indigenous peoples. I'll hand it over to Maui.
Kia ora koutou katoa, mihi anei tēnei ata, tēnei ahiahi, ko Maui Hudson tukuingoa, no te whakatohia. So my name is Maui Hudson, I'm a member of the Whakatohia Nation, but I'm based at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, which is on the lands of the Waikato Tainui people. So great to be here. I'm in control of the slides, so I'll get that started and we'll get into it. So yeah, so kia ora. It's great to be here and actually talking about how we support the recognition of Indigenous rights and interests in collections and open data. And so and this is an area which we've been thinking about and doing activities in for a number of years now. And one of the, I guess, trying to think about what the challenges that sits in front of us. There's a large number of collections and a large number of material that's been generated that reflects Indigenous information, Indigenous data, Indigenous knowledge, whether it's their intangible cultural material, and it's sitting in archives, museums, libraries, repositories, all these different places which are making it available for anyone to look at. And often there's significant information about those collections, like individuals' names or community names, this sort of information that acknowledges the provenance of or where that material came from, that's missing. And this is something that's exacerbated because Indigenous communities usually aren't even recognized as rights holders. So they won't hold a copyright. They won't be the person that's recognized in the record in that manner either. And so as we've had an increasing level of digitization and these things shift from physical records into electronic collections or digital collections, those mistakes get translated and become part of the digital life of that material too. And so we can think about it as something that is a historical problem that's been translated into the contemporary context, but it's also sitting there as there's more and more research that's taking place now, and there's new information that's been added into this sort of these constructs and frameworks. And so if we don't have space for those things to be included, then they're always going to be missing going forward. And so part of the, I guess, intersecting elements or narratives that start to come into play has been this emerging one around Indigenous data sovereignty, which has really been thinking about what are the rights and interests of Indigenous communities in relation to these, in relation to data, in relation to digital records. And it draws on ideas that come out of Indigenous rights or treaty rights, cultural intellectual property rights, and Indigenous research ethics. And it's primarily focused on the idea that communities should be able to access data, and that's so that it can support their decision making. So it's data for governance. And that if other people are accessing some of this information, they should be able to have a say over for what purpose that data is being accessed. And so this idea of governance of data. And these are these things which they have to balance. And you can find, you can read a lot more about Indigenous data sovereignty in these two publications that are here on the slides. And just wanted to acknowledge in this context as well, the First Nations Indigenous Governance Centre and the OCAP principle. So, this emerged from a Canadian context and in many ways represents probably the strongest expression of Indigenous data sovereignty. It's really focused on ensuring that ownership and control sits with the communities themselves, and then they're in a position to decide, what does access look like and how that comes about. Now, in a number of situations, that's not possible because the collections sit under the authority or the stewardship or the responsibility of the archival museum. And those things aren't always in a position to be translated or transferred. And so we end up in this conversation about how Indigenous communities can be involved in the governance of that information. What sorts of things can be put in place so that it meets the principles that are being reflected here as the care principles for Indigenous data governance, which focus on collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And these principles have been set up to sit alongside the FAIR principles. And the FAIR principles are sort of principles that support an open data movement. So this push towards making or having open access to data in a whole variety of different contexts, and thinking about the way the data is organized so that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But those principles focus primarily on how the data is organized, what the characteristics of the data is. And the Indigenous principles are more about what is the purpose, what is the purpose around the use of that data? Who are the people that are using it? And so they end up being complementary in that regard. And the other kind of element, which I think filters into the development, the reason around how the traditional knowledge and the biocultural labels were generated, is this issue around the copyright and that legal responsibility not being able to be held by the community itself. So, the time limitations that sit in that place, it means that researchers can come in and start to write stories of communities and then be assigned a copyright for material that belongs to those communities. And even in a sort of a Creative Commons context, where people are saying it's fine for this to be used by others, that happens off the back of having the copyright. So you have to have a claim to the copyright before you can say that actually we'll use it in this open manner. And it's those two, or that situation, which led to the development of the labels as a way of trying to reinsert the cultural authority or recognize the cultural authority alongside these legal recognitions.
So the traditional knowledge labels were developed over 10 years ago, and they were developed as a particular intervention to deal with, as Maui was speaking to, the problem that Indigenous communities don't have ownership or control over their cultural heritage material that is sitting within cultural institutions. So as non-legal rights holders, you can't have a license over that. You can't exert any control. And so we initially began thinking through what would it look like if we could create a certain kind of intervention that was also one that conveyed cultural authority digitally into the infrastructures in a different kind of way. And that's kind of what our starting point with the TK labels were. There are now 20 traditional knowledge labels, and they really reflect cultural protocols, Indigenous expectations around sharing. These are just 3 examples of the TK labels. This is the attribution label, the culturally sensitive label, and the seasonal label. And they all do quite different things. Attribution obviously is working to bring Indigenous names back into the record. So it's actually names count, names matter. And because of the exclusion of Indigenous names, that has a whole lot of consequences into the future. So the attribution label is often a label that communities first use to bring names back into the record. And then these other labels, the culturally sensitive, kind of recognizing that certain kinds of material that is available to the public should not necessarily be available to the public, or has certain sensitivities around how that should be circulated. It just gives people a sense that they need to be careful with certain kinds of material. Different kinds of concerns exist. And then with the TK seasonal label, it's one of my favorite labels in the sense because it connects land and waters to knowledge. The way in which traditional intellectual property law or traditional property law works keeps those 2 things separated. But within the labels, because they're an extra legal initiative, we're allowed to bring them together and to kind of say, actually, these teachings, these stories that are told at a particular time of the year that are dependent upon the first snow or harvesting sweetgrass are connected to land. And they're connected to the way in which knowledge is shared and different kinds of teachings about that land are conveyed. What's important to know about the labels and how they function is that those icons that you see remain stable. You can't change those, partly because this is an international system. Indigenous cultural material is all over the world. We needed something that remained standardized across different kinds of contexts. But every community is able to customize the labels. That means kind of create them in a way that reflects their own interests. And this is an example of that with the Skolits band of the Stolo First Nation. This is their customization of the attribution label into Hulkamalum, and kind of speaks to why the Skolits have decided to use this label as well. And so this is kind of where the customization or the kind of sovereign decision making exists within each community and with each context. So the labels really convey 3 key things. They convey provenance. Where does knowledge come from? Where does Indigenous knowledge come from? It puts Indigenous names back in the record, as I said earlier, but also kind of indicates different kinds of community relationships, family relationships that might exist around how certain kinds of information is shared. There are cultural protocols that are part of the labeling system as well. So the seasonal label is part of a protocols label, is how we might kind of describe it. But there's also different kinds of protocols around certain kinds of people that have responsibility for sharing certain kinds of knowledge, whether that's by gender, whether that's by family, and that's also in relationship to restricted or culturally sensitive information. The third category that we have for the labels is around permissions, the different kinds of permissions that communities would like in relationship to sharing their material. So it's important to kind of say in the first instance, before we kind of get any further, that we developed the traditional knowledge and the biocultural labels for Indigenous communities. Only Indigenous communities can customize those labels, and then they deliver them to institutions. We also have tools that we'll talk about a little bit later that are specifically designed for institutions and for researchers who want to disclose Indigenous interests and create the space and the pathway for the cultural authority that's embedded in the labels to come back into the digital infrastructures.
So here's the one of the examples which we're just going to talk through, really to illustrate how the what the labels do in the context of digital infrastructures. And this is an example with the Passamaquoddy tribe, which is in Maine, and their relationship with the Library of Congress. And it related to a series of wax cylinder recordings that were made by Jesse Fuchs in the early 1800s. And it was, the recordings came about as they decided, as they were actually testing the technology. So it was a new technology at the time. And they were just checking to see that it worked. But through that process, they actually did the first ever recordings that were done on tribal lands. And so this is the record as it sat within the Library of Congress. And so you can see here that there's very little information about the community itself, and no information about what's on the recordings. There's a kind of a reference to a war song. And also that it is now, the rights are now held by the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. And so as that sat there, you can see all of these issues which we talked about are reflected in this record. But through the engagement that the community took place with the Library of Congress, with the help of Jane and her other colleagues, they were able to bring traditional knowledge into this record. And so this is what the record looks like now. And you see a whole lot of additional information. Traditional knowledge which is being put into the public record. And part of the reason that people were comfortable with that is because you can see, right there up front, the traditional knowledge labels that are sort of recognizing the community through the attribution label, acknowledging that this material can be used for outreach, but also saying that it can't be used for commercial purposes. And so part of this this project and this process has supported the relationship between these two entities, but also started to make changes within the infrastructure of the university itself. And so the records needed to be changed to make space for the labels. And that's both the MARC record, but also where things sit in relation to how it gets recognized as a part of Dublin Core. And you see the traditional knowledge labels there sitting in the rights fields. There needed to be a change to the infrastructure itself. So the database, the JSON files that provide the structure for all of the records. So now that traditional knowledge labels have been put in place for the Passamaquoddy tribe, that can be added to any other item that sits within the Library of Congress. So not just making a change to the single record, but a change to the infrastructure that holds the records and starts to open up and enable this recognition of Indigenous rights and interests in relation to their material. And I think the other really key component of this was the way in which the traditional knowledge labels could sit alongside the rights that were held by Harvard University. So the place in the rights advisory, which would normally only be recognizing intellectual property rights, is now reflecting this cultural intellectual property right that the labels are expressing. And you'll see here that the Library of Congress made a decision to make those the first rights and have them sitting above the intellectual property right that still remains in place.
So this is just another example with the Penobscot Nation in relationship to establishing cultural authority over collections within university contexts. So if the Passamaquoddy example is one within an institution like the Library of Congress, this is kind of one that speaks to universities and the different kinds of rights and responsibilities that exist within universities to acknowledge Indigenous authority within their collections. So the Penobscot Nation signed a significant memorandum of understanding in 2018 with the University of Maine. And one of the parts of that memorandum of understanding, or MOU as I'll refer to it going forward, is that MOU for the first time recognized that the university was on traditional Penobscot lands. And that kind of started or it kind of initiated a dialogue around how and what are the other processes that the university needs to go through to properly recognize Indigenous cultural authority across a variety of departments and collections. So the MOU, which is available publicly online, and we can put that in the chat as well, speaks to adding the traditional knowledge labels into the library, into the special collections. It talks about authority around the museum and the museum holdings, but it also speaks to publications and the way in which Indigenous or Penobscot information would be shared in the future in publications coming out of the University of Maine Press. So it's quite a detailed MOU, but it really leverages the labels as a particular tool that can be utilized to bring that authority back into the university system at large. So Penobscot have taken that and kind of then also thought, well, it's not only historical collections that we're dealing with. There are, as we were talking earlier, an enormous amount of researchers that continue to work within a Penobscot context. And there are collections that are constantly given to institutions. And so this is an agreement, a future acquisitions agreement that was developed with the Penobscot Nation about collections and data that asks institutions when they receive collections that have Penobscot interests that they're involved in the decision-making about how those collections are catalogued, the different kinds of metadata that is created around those collections, and how they're stewarded and cared for into the future. So this is an important kind of document that is about negotiating future control. It asks for the deposit or transfer of the collection in the first instance, and if that's not possible, sets out a couple of steps that then an institution can go through with the Penobscot Nation to make sure that that control from Penobscot standpoint is there from the beginning moving forward.
And so part of my sort of introduction into the local context scene was being shared examples from how the traditional knowledge labels work. And Sarah, part of my work had been around thinking about, how Indigenous knowledges intersect with science, how they work along together. In some context, it was thinking about where traditional knowledge sits in decision-making. And that can be both in places like sort of institutions and museums, but also into, we say, environmental decision-making places where, traditional knowledge is being asked to be brought forward and then put into that context, but then it sits with those government agencies or those decision-making bodies as things go forward. So it's always been a challenge. And then also thinking about what it means in terms of genetic resources, and been involved with helping put together different guidelines for Māori communities here around genetic resources. So the same issue arises where our Indigenous flora and fauna is sequenced that creates data, which is then shared in open databases around the world. And how do we retain that the interest in that material? And so this is where we began working together around labels that could reflect the same relationship or the relationship that communities have with their flora and fauna that comes from their territories. And there's some slight differences in the way that comes about, at least in the sense of we still want to recognize the provenance and how that connects those things to our communities. But there's often not the sort of traditional protocols in place that are thinking about that sort of information. And so the labels here tend to speak more to the provenance relationships, but also the sorts of things you might permission into the future, or the sorts of relationships you might like to have into the future, whether that's around research, collaboration, or commercialization. And what I was trying to do was, or what the labels help us do, is recognize that those rights and interests sit there within that open data environment. And these are issues that Indigenous peoples have been talking about in the international environment for a long time. There's been lots of discussions about how to collaborate around ethical access and use, people have developed biocultural protocols in different contexts, and that's why we've taken on the use of or the term biocultural labels for this material. And a lot of it's been thinking about should commercial activities emerge in the future, whether those are sort of different sorts of pharmaceutical products or other things, that there's appropriate benefit sharing that takes place. And that can only happen if there's a relationship with the community and there's a way of linking back to that community. So that's where we think the labels have a role to play.
So as we've been building out this project, and I think I mentioned that it's a project that spans over a decade now in terms of kind of development and partnership with communities to initially develop the labels and then think about what are the other tools that are required for institutions and for researchers, is that we developed these notices, and the notices really function as a mechanism of disclosure, a means for disclosing Indigenous rights and interests, and to make transparent within collections where there are those Indigenous interests. And in many ways, it was in response to both institutions saying, what can we do? We know that we have problems within our collections. We want to do the right thing, but we kind of need a tool that can help make it more transparent what's in our collections, so that Indigenous communities and invite the partnerships that we know we need to have in order to kind of understand these collections differently. At the same time, also responding to Indigenous communities who are saying, this is an enormous amount of invisible labour for us to find our collections. It'll take us decades to find our collections. And so kind of shifting some of the responsibility into an institutional context and giving a mechanism that can both make that visible, make those collections like visible and transparent, that then allow communities to focus on the work of labeling those collections and bringing their cultural protocols back into those spaces rather than having to find their collections. So there's a biocultural notice, a traditional knowledge notice, an attribution incomplete notice, and an open to collaborate notice. And these notices, as I said, are really focused on as a tool for institutions and for researchers. This is just one example of the Open to Collaborate notice being utilised by Simon Fraser University in the George and Joanne MacDonald Northwest Coast Image Archive. What this notice is doing here at SFU is saying, okay, we're ready to begin the process of doing the work that will mean partnering with Indigenous communities to actually know what's in this photographic archive. It is the most frequented archive within SFU. So it really made sense for them to kind of start this process and say, okay, we're committed to working on this and to working with these and developing these partnerships. This is another example of the notice in a university context at the University of Tasmania. Again, speaking to making visible and transparent certain kinds of responsibilities that the institution as a repository has towards its Indigenous communities that sit around and don't always have access to those collections. So this is again kind of tends to be the first instance, and then you get into the collection, into the items themselves that allows Indigenous communities to bring their cultural authority back into those spaces. This is an example of the Open to Collaborate within a genomic database called Geome. Again, kind of promoting the possibility of equitable metadata and equitable metadata structures within a place like Geome, which is a metadata database that really allows, again, the kind of expression of Indigenous interests. This is just kind of what that looks like within the metadata for Geome.
And so, this sort of relationship that exists between the notices and labels. I know this is a horrible slide, but it's trying to kind of illustrate a few things here, and it's also a transition into Felicia and Corey being able to talk about how the hub itself works. So we've talked about the notices and the disclosures that get made by institutions around material. Part of the transition into the local context hub so that we can deal with both the way people see and read the label, so the human readability component, but also wanting that to be able to be sort of supported and facilitated by the computers, sort of the machine readability of them, which means putting unique identifiers against different communities' labels and being able to connect those with notices that have been put in place. So a research or institution can go onto the hub, they can add notices to any particular project they're working with. Those notices will go and sit with that material in the repository, but it will also create a notification to communities, either directly if that community is already in the hub, or as an invitation to them to join the hub. As the community starts to think about the way in which they would like to customize the label and have that done, and then decide which of the labels they would apply to any particular to a particular notice, they can do that from within the hub, and then those notices can get replaced automatically using an API. And so trying to really facilitate this process that allows for this exchange, but just knowing that if it needs to scale to deal with all of the collections that people have, then it will need to be supported by automatically with machines. So I'm going to stop sharing here so that Felicia and Corey can continue with their demo.
All right, so I will share my screen. Let's see if I can. There we go. And Corey and I are just going to do a really quick demo illustrating that workflow that Maui mentioned, going from an institutional notice to a community label. And so here is the local context hub dashboard. This is my personal account, and this is the test site actually. That's important to note. We have the live site, but this is just a place where folks can go to test out some of the features of the hub. As Maui mentioned, there's different account types, the community accounts here, which can customize and apply labels, and then institutional accounts and researcher accounts, which can apply notices. So I'll go into the community account and then let Corey talk a bit about the projects on the hub.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. So we're going to look at an example project that I've already sent to the community here. In the hub, any account type can create a project. If you are an institution or researcher account, you apply notices to that project, and you may wish to notify a community about it. And if you're a community, you can create a project and apply your own labels right to that project. So here on this page, we see a couple different projects that have been shared with this community or created by this community. And I'm looking at the second one, Southwest Language Dictionary. That is an example again that we've created for today. As you can see, there's some very basic information that's entered about the project. You can link out to databases or collection management systems where this content exists. And you can also invite collaborators in the hub or invite them to join the hub. So once you've created a project in the hub, it creates a unique ID, which you can use with our API to extract the information about the project. But here we have notices applied, and it's been shared with the community. And I think, Felicia, I'll toss it back to you to say what a community can do if they receive a project like this.
Thanks, Corey. So there are a couple of different options here to engage with the institution on this project. If you scroll down, you can see there's this drop down that says project decision. And so I can select acknowledge notice, labels pending, or no labels pending if I don't intend to apply labels to this project. And then just click notify to provide a quick response to the institution regarding the project. There's also a built-in messaging feature, so I can just confirm that I received the project or maybe ask any questions that I might have for the institution here. But I'm just going to go ahead and show you what the label application process looks like. And so as Corey mentioned, you can see the notices that were sent with the project here. And I'll click apply labels. And so these are the labels that I've already customized within this community account. As Jane mentioned with the Scowlets example, the labels are meant to be customized. You can change the name, the description, and you can add a translation, though the image remains the same. And so these ones have already been customized. I can also go in and customize more labels via this link that's up here. But I'm just going to go ahead and select some that are already here. So I'll do the outreach label and the attribution label. And then once you click them, you can see the description and the name here before you apply. So I'll click apply. And as you can see, here is our project here, the Southwest Language Dictionary, and the notices that were there before have now been replaced with labels. And I think that's it for our demo. Corey, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think that was just a brief look at the hub, and we're always happy to meet with folks who are interested in learning more.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to present. We do have a few questions and comments in the Q&A in the chat. So if anyone else has any more questions or comments, just feel free to drop them in the Q&A in the chat. So we'll start. Marianne just says there are some links in the presentation. Will the presentation be shared with participants, or where can you find the presentation online?
We can definitely share the presentation with you, Stephen, so that you can then share that with the participants. Also, Jeanette has been putting some of the links in the chat as well as we've been going ahead.
Awesome, perfect. Now I see Corey put some Instagram and social media links in the chat as well, which is good. She's great. So in the chat, Paul says, "I love this work. Can you say a few words about the extent of global reach, involvement, and agreement with this approach by different Indigenous cultures around the world?"
I'll begin there, and then I'll kind of throw it to Maui. So this is a project that has been picked up by Indigenous communities internationally as something that is responded. The challenge being that the way in which intellectual property functions is very similar across multiple jurisdictions. And so this is actually a mechanism that was designed to be used by communities internationally. We have communities in Laos, for example, who are using the labels, as well as Australia, New Zealand, the US, obviously. And to some extent, it is, at the moment, it has been kind of largely a little bit dominant with the kind of English-speaking countries, though we have done a lot of work of translating the labels, and we have communities in Chile and in Mexico that are also starting to utilize the labels, partly because it answers a very specific question that communities have, which is how do we control our cultural heritage, and how do we control our data, and how do we maintain that so that we can participate in those decisions about how it's used into the future. Maui?
Yeah, and I think the it's emerged in part through the relationship with Mukutu, which was an Indigenous content management system, and as it's been hardwired into there's a number of communities that are using that platform, which have then decided to adopt the labels through that avenue. It's certainly even here in the New Zealand context, there's particular contexts and particular communities that have a sort of a need, which has them then gravitate towards using the labels over doing other things. And I think we're always saying that the labels don't do everything. They can't help with every context, but they're often a little bit of a pathway to then getting to where communities want to be, and that might be around repatriation or the return of material from different sort of contexts back to the community. And then this, the use of the labels is often a way of helping to initiate some of those conversations and work up to that point. So it sort of varies in different places, but we're trying to put in place the infrastructure to allow for that to be used by more communities around the world.
Awesome.
I
Thank
see
you
there
so
was
much.
another question
Yeah.
there about the WIPO stuff. So
Yeah, I was just
gonna
about to mention that. So Paul again asked, does this work somehow dovetail or influence efforts by international library organizations like the IFLA or international intellectual property organizations like WIPO?
Yeah, it does, and that's a great question as well. We originally had funding from, like, WIPO was one of the kind of first funders of this project back in 2010, and kind of understanding that there really was no mechanism that could actually deal with some of the problems that Indigenous communities were having. There's kind of already existing law, and then there's licensing, which is already sitting within a kind of a contractual kind of framework of the way in which law functions, but there was nothing in between. And so this has kind of been something that both is promoted by the World Intellectual Property Organization, certainly as well because we're dealing with biological collections and the way in which that is kind of dealt with within the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there's kind of like this stretch across these different kinds of international policy making contexts. And we're very active within those spaces, but our kind of focus is really what is the practical mechanism look like? How do you deliver this on the ground for communities today, tomorrow, for the next 7 generations? And this is kind of what we're focused on. So it dovetails with a lot of that international policy, but it kind of brings a practical mechanism into those policy discussions.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then another question in the Q&A. So what do communities need to have in place in terms of tech capacity and connectivity?
Sorry, I've got my children have just come home, so you probably can hear that in the background. So you go.
Yeah. I'll just give it a little bit of an experience of our community, if I could talk here. We've just been starting to work with the community around using the labels, and it was definitely helpful for us to have a sort of a unit that was already focused on building capacity around digital spaces. So with like a Digital Natives Academy, helping with coding, kind of teaching coding to primary school kids and things like that. So they're also the ones that are involved with some of the digitization activities, including creating an app of our traditional songs. And so I think being involved in that context made it easier for them to see where the labels could be applied and how they could operate. It was also useful sort of contrast that with a couple of other groups we're working with, because they were had a unit that was full-time working in that space. So it wasn't something that sat alongside. And so I think, trying to find where is the right place within the community where that responsibility for kind of shifting the movement along was important, because it's, there's an element of the person that will, deal with the hub, but they actually have to talk to the community. There's end up with the sort of conversations around governance. So you get the support from your tribal council for the activity to take place. Then who are the sort of cultural experts that are informing what the right way of customizing or wording the labels would look like, and then how they might connect to things. So there's a couple of layers that need to be developed to support it to work in a kind of a well-functioning manner. I don't know if Corey or Felicia want to add to that.
Just to say that the hub is meant to be a tool to help communities, and I think Jane has talked about this before, that if a community is more offline and doing that work offline, then we want whatever works best for the Indigenous communities.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, I think just awareness too, because I knew a little bit about the hub coming into this and the work of local context, but this has given me a lot more knowledge and insight into what you folks do. So it's been great, and yeah, just awareness is always important. That's why we like to do things like this, especially during Open Education Week. If anyone, I see Paul had a comment in the chat, but I see Jane.
Sorry, I just jumped in and answered.
No worries. I can repeat Paul's question if anyone has anything else to add. So sorry, Paul says places like Ecuador have revised their constitution and specifically incorporated into their constitution conservation and sustainable uses of natural resources, especially biodiversity and ancestral knowledge. They seem like a perfect match for this. So do you advise governments on this approach, which might entail actual policy around implementing this across an entire country? So Jane answered a little bit, but if anyone has anything else to add.
So we had been asked to contribute to some of the conversations, particularly happening around use of traditional knowledge and digital sequence information. It was really to the expert working group that's putting together some of the policy options for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then we've been having some discussions in some sort of different, I guess, government contexts. I think there's a certain thing here is if you do want to be able to scale it, and this is certainly an aspiration to see it being supported by governments so that the interests of Indigenous communities within them will be recognised throughout an entire system. And that's not just the community's own internal databases or even the institutional one. It's like when people are accessing that information and then pushing it into another place. So there's lots of places that aggregate data from different databases. And so in that system, you need a way of recognizing that interest still remains. As outputs get created and it ends up in a sort of a journal article somewhere, how do the interests of the community or the labels get reflected in those environments? So there's a number of conversations which we're having to try and ensure that the use of the labels will maintain some transparency, but also be persistent throughout the kind of wider ecosystem. And that's, different conversations at sort of local, national, and international levels.
Thank you so much.
I was just saying the other interesting thing about that is that actually some of these discussions we're having with places like DataSite are involving institutions that are based, primarily in Canada. So I think the interest is definitely there in a Canadian context to think about better ways of doing things and better ways of recognising Indigenous rights and interests.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that obviously, this is one tool and it's like filling a space where there wasn't anything. So it won't get at all the different kinds of issues. And I think this is where, Maui started off talking about the care principles as at a kind of much higher level policy kind of framework. And we see how important those care principles are in terms of kind of like setting the certain kinds of obligations that we want to see not only governments but also institutions moving towards in relationship to how they think about the sovereignty around Indigenous data. I would also say that we're working the labels fit within kind of one space. We've kind of got other kind of larger principles that kind of inform that, but then also we have certain kinds of interventions that we've been involved in, like the IEEE provenance for Indigenous people's data as another kind of initiative that starts to establish standards in this space. And what does standards look like, and what are the obligations, and kind of what does that mean? And so I'm just going to drop that in the chat as well for those people that are interested. That working group is open. If anybody on this call would like to join that working group, we've kind of got to the stage of writing the recommended practice in relationship to that. But, all of these things start pointing to how important it is that Indigenous people are able to control and have governance and decision-making over their data.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A? While we give people some time to think, I'm just going to drop my own webinar or workshop I'm doing tomorrow, just to do a little self-promotion. So I'm doing a workshop, a 1 hour workshop on Pressbooks and a broad overview of the eCampus Terry Pressbooks instance. So if anyone on the chat wants to attend that tomorrow, it's from 12 to 1, and I'm dropping the registration link the chat. Just a little a shameless self-plug there for our Open Education Week event tomorrow, if anyone's interested. Let's see, Patricia, I'm just reading the chat. So Patricia just says, as an such an informative presentation. Thank you. As a former archive researcher, so great to see the changes and possibilities now for Indigenous people to claim control over heritage and data. And I completely agree. It's great. It's great to see this growing and the work that you folks are doing at local context. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much. And I just would say there's two more examples that I may as well we didn't have in our presentation, but are kind of worth mentioning here is people using the labels on curriculum, particularly curriculum that's been developed with Indigenous communities or with elders, again, kind of indicating how particular stories should be used and the different kinds of cultural protocols and what that is, both for lecturers and professors, but also for students. So that's kind of one interesting way where the labels are also being used. But also in digital presses. So Raven Space Press is a press that has used the labels as part of publications, particularly when there is a collaboration between Indigenous communities and a press. And so they're kind of just other examples where, the labels and the notices are very flexible tools. They can be used in a number of different kinds of contexts. And so they're just two more that I wanted to leave you with at the end of this webinar.
Awesome. Well, perfect. If there's no more questions, just again want to say thank you so much for taking the time to present on your work and nutritional knowledge and biocultural labels. It's been wonderful. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm excited for eCampus Ontario to work with traditional knowledge and biocultural labels, and with local context. I'm sure we're going to be reaching out to Corey soon for a hub tutorial, a more in-depth hub tutorial. So very excited for that.
Sure.
Thanks
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.